Hi there. Thank you for joining us for this very special panel. I'm Esmy Jimenez. I'm a senior reporter at the Boston Globe, and I'm excited to present to you today some very special guests. I have with me Julia Mejia, Boston City Councilor at Large. I have Michelle de la Isla, Chief Executive Officer at Hack.Diversity, a nonprofit organization creating opportunities for people of color in tech. And I have Yordan Villalon. He is the Associate Executive Director for the Boston Celtics. Thank you all for joining us today. It is a pleasure to have your expertise. Okay, so we have limited time, and with that in mind, I want to jump right back in so our guests can learn from you. First things first, I want to start with you, Councilor Mejia. Tell me about your move into politics. I understand you were born in the Dominican Republic. You were raised in Dorchester. You were, of course, the first Latina and the first Afro-Latina on the Boston City Council. So can you share what your experience has been in the world of politics? I feel like politics, especially with the Afro-Latina experience, that is misunderstood and often not really represented at all. So tell me about how you've approached this. What kind of leadership approach have you taken?
Yeah, so I'm super excited to be here. So I think my first political act, I was 9 years old. I was in the welfare office translating on behalf of my mom. And this is where I learned how to utilize my voice. As Afro-Latina, I had to learn how to speak English so that I can translate on behalf of my mom. And when I came to this country, it was at the height of the busing era. And I was told to go back to where I came from. So from the beginning of my journey here in the city of Boston, it has been political. I came here as Julia Melania Mejia Peña. And within months, I was Julia Mejia. I dropped all of those extra last names because it was nothing that I wanted to be. I didn't want to stand out. I really wanted to acclimate into the culture. And being Latina, and being an Afro-Latina, claiming my roots was also part of my journey. You know, I always talk about the fact that when they abducted our ancestors, the only difference was the port that they dropped us off at, right? So as a Dominican, I understand what my cultural roots are. We share the island with the island of Quisqueya with Haiti, right? So when we think about Blackness and when we think about politics, right? There's so much nuances. And in particular, in the Dominican Republic, there are a lot of issues of colorism, right? So I'm a light-skinned Latina, and I always say I might be light-skinned, but I'm the blackest of them all in my household because I understand what history defines us as, right? And so I think showing up on the Boston City Council as the first Latina, I was told, why do I have to say Afro-Latina? Why can't I just be a Latina? And I said, I'm an Afro-Latina because if they don't know what an Afro-Latina is, they can Google it, period, right? And I think that that has been part of my identity. And I think that what that has done is the way that I show up in this world is about creating space for people to see the complexities of being Latinx with Afro roots. And I think those two things are a beautiful blend of how I show up in this world and how unapologetic I am about the conversations that make people feel really uncomfortable.
Well, muchas gracias for this respuesta. I love where we're going with this. Michelle, I want to go next to you because I know you were also in politics, right? You were the first mayor of Topeka, who was a Latina, also an Afro-Latina. What about your experience in politics? And how does that differ from the nonprofit world now?
It's interesting. I think that at the time that I ran for office, I remember getting involved in the community, not knowing that I was doing community organizing because I was just putting our gente together to talk about downtown redevelopment, right? And somebody tells me in Topeka, Kansas, hey, you should run for council. And I'm like, one of these things is not like the other, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I don't know if I'm going to get elected. And it wasn't as bad seeing the intersection of who I was as a single parent, as an Afro-Latina woman, in running for council. Where it really showed up was in the race for mayor and in the race for Congress. And it was very interesting to see what was being said and what the attacks were. Like, oh my gosh, she is a single mom and she has a full-time job. Can she be mayor? And I was the only person of color running the race. Out of 5 individuals, they were all white male. And it was an interesting situation. And I think that people thought for a while there when the news came out that Topeka had a much more diverse community. Topeka is 8% Black, 14% Latino. And it is very interesting that I love the fact that you talk about the complexity of being Afro-Latina, because I've always been proud of my Black roots. And I was labeled Latina, Latina. And I'm like, I am also Black. And it's very interesting that people seem to want to leave that part out. Because, of course, in our communities, there was so much colorism, the colonialism impact of how we're supposed to show up so that we're not excluded in rooms, but also what makes people a little bit more comfortable. So that's how it kind of showed up. But I think that in the leadership aspect, I always say this to people, what makes me authentic is the fact that I am who I am, and I'm proud of who I am, of all of the blood that I carry inside of me from all my ancestors that are magic. And that I'm willing to bring that into the leadership realm, which is something that, especially in a place where there's not a lot of diversity, was very effective.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. And then, Yordan, I want to go to you as well, because I know a couple interesting things about you when I was looking you up. You were on the 2022 list of Latino leaders, 30 under 30. And you were also the founder of Cubans in Boston. So I guess tell me a little bit more about what inspired you to create this group, and what does it mean for you now, several years after its creation?
Yeah, thank you for the question. 1 million Latinos in Massachusetts, 20,000 of those are Cubans. And while it's a small number, it's a growing number at a rapid rate. And when you think about that number juxtaposed to the rest of the Latino population, I think we get clumped in and kind of get a monolithic view on some of our identities. And identity is such a special thing to all of us as Latinos. But what inspired me to create Cubans in Boston was that if we don't speak up and tell our stories, somebody else will tell the stories for you. And not only will they tell the stories for you, but they'll vote on the story for you. And that's meaningful to me because my frame of reference is somebody that left my family, friends, neighbors in Cuba in 1999. And in 2021, when the island uprose together in demand of change, their voices were being prosecuted. So I thought of two words: action and accountability. What can I do to echo their voices here in the Commonwealth? And Cubans in Boston was born. And since then, we've been talking about the wide range of Cuban experiences. And that's meaningful to me because that's my family, that's my friends, people that I remember leaving, and I haven't been able to see them since. And some, like the first person I remember loving, my grandmother, has passed away. And that's my reality. But there's many others and much harsher realities. But it's important to tell your story, or else somebody else will tell it for you, and they'll also vote on it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think you're absolutely right. To be honest with you, that's why I went into media, because I feel like a lot of the times I was like, that's not what I think the story should be. I don't think that's how the story should be told. And eventually I complained enough that someone was like, well, why don't you try it? So I was like, all right, I'd rather try and fail than keep saying some of these narratives that are just not multifaceted. They're not nuanced. The ability to have you guys here today, and immediately I see you guys shaking your heads, or we're able to talk about colorism, right? Yeah. I think that's so fascinating. I kind of wanted to go back to that subject because both of you, I saw you shaking your heads earlier. I guess maybe let's start with you, Councilor. Speak a little bit more about those isms that are coming up in our communities.
Yeah. So I'm really grateful. Tanisha Sullivan, who's the president of the NAACP, reached out to my office a few years ago and asked me to file a hearing order around reparations in the city of Boston. And again, being a light-skinned Latina, I had the audacity to do such a thing. And the process of going from introducing an idea of reparations here in the city of Boston, one of the most racist cities in the country, at least it's known for racism here in Boston, I was a little bit nervous to be a light-skinned Latina leading in this way. And the backlash that I received on both, from all sides. Well, white folks were not happy, Latinos were not happy, and Black folks were not happy either, right? So the colorism situation is because I think I experienced some of that backlash, because as a Latina, why was I leading on an issue that most people didn't think pertained to me? And for me, it wasn't about my reparations. For me, it was about liberation for Black people, right? And I think that the colorism conversation really bubbled up to the top during that conversation, because there were a lot of folks who were then talking about who is owed reparations. Is it Black Americans? Is it African Americans? So the complexities of that I really saw in the political discourse. And then in my own country, in the Dominican Republic, there's a story that I tell because it really brought me literally to tears. I have a niece who's half Haitian and half Dominican, and I was visiting my country, the Dominican Republic, during Christmas, and I couldn't find a Black doll anywhere. And I went up to one of the customer service reps, and I was like, "Y'all don't have any Black dolls?" She was darker, right, than me and my niece. And she said, "Black dolls? Who wants, eso es feo. Who wants Black dolls?" in front of my little niece. And that happened like 12 or 13 years ago, but it really struck a chord for me because the colorism is so real and so deeply rooted in hate and self-hate. And so those are the stories that I like to tell. And the last thing that I'll say is that in 2010, during the census, when you had to pick a race, my mother, who's darker than me, I said, "You have to pick a race." And she was like, "India." I'm like, "No, you're not India. Okay, so stop that." And then she says, I told my mom, "Negra, you're Black." She goes, "I'm not Black." She goes, "You're Black. Look at your hair." Right? So my mom has straighter hair than me. So it goes beyond the color. There's just so many layers of self-hate in throughout the diaspora that I think it's really important for us as a people to recognize those isms and how they show up, and how we actually sometimes transfer that hate onto our children without even realizing it. So all of that to say is that there's a lot of work to do when it comes to colorism here and abroad.
Right. Michelle, Yordan, I want you to be able to jump in.
Absolutely. So I love the fact I'm sitting here and I'm pondering on the fact that all of us are Caribeños. So all of us have this shared history of Spain coming,
Yep.
taking over, decimating the native community. If you look at our DNAs, we have a lot of natives in us, Taino for me. But you also have the richness of the African culture that was brought into our countries, right? I was born in New York, but I was raised in Puerto Rico. So my ancestry comes from this beautiful, diverse place. And I will never forget the first time that I had to grapple with the fact that I wasn't white. Because to me, color, like my family was so diverse. Like I grew up speaking Italian to Mima, my grandfather. I grew up speaking Spanish to Mama. And then I grew up speaking English to my mom, right? And I knew that we were all kind of different, but it didn't matter. And it wasn't until I really started interacting with my paternal grandmother. And out of everybody, I was one of the darkest skins. My mom is much darker than me, but we never talked about that. And then I was la negrita. Ay, mira la negrita, the little Black one. Mira la negrita, la negrita, la negrita. Y ese pelo, mira ese pelo, mira ese pelo. We got to straighten that hair. We got to straighten that hair. And I did not know. And as a child, you just don't understand, what the separation is. I remember that my brother, because he was lighter skinned and when he was young, he had super straight hair. Ay, qué lindo el nene. Oh my God, he's so beautiful. Look at little Ray. Mira qué hermoso. Y mira ella con el pelo. Ay, Dios mío, ese pelo, that hair. And it was just like, I never got it. And it wasn't until I started digging a little bit into owning my Blackness, because I started understanding, like, oh, obviously my hair, my nose, my skin color, especially when I get a fabulous tan, I get super dark. And I love it. But for some reason, that was a problem. And it wasn't until I started talking to my grandmother before she died. And I started learning about the fact that my grandmother, who is obviously brown, like checked all the boxes for white, calling herself white. And it was because she was left out of places in New York. And she tried to pass till the moment that that woman died. She dyed her hair red and straightened it, right? And we carried those things. Later, I find out that we have a history of people that were brought in boats. My great-great-great Jibojo great-great-grandmother, right? Slaves. And you start thinking about everything and the narratives that were being passed on for people to be able to survive and thrive. in our culture, which you would never think that it would happen, like being othered, even though you speak the same language, are living in the same place, and are having the same challenges from everybody else on the outside. And then the interesting part is, for me especially, I just graduated from the Kennedy School, and it was so interesting that I was not able to fit in. You want to talk about colorism? Like, I was able to hang out with a few of the Black students that thought that I was Black enough to be Black. But then the Latino students didn't consider me Latina enough because I was born in the States. And even though I spoke Spanish and shared the culture and shared the ritmo and the music, I didn't share the fact that I was struggling in order for me to have a visa to come into this country. So there's so much complexity, especially for our group, that kind of is also teetering on figuring out where we belong. And it is so interesting because it's all imparted to us by the phenomenon of colonialism and just people wanting to box people.
Yordan?
Yeah, I think identity is something so deeply personal, and it often gets looked at a macro level, and we tend to lean on that because at the end of the day, so many of us want to belong and be a part of something. So we want to belong to a group or be around people that maybe sound like us or look like us. And then you're around that group and you're realizing you're nothing like that group, or these people don't support you in the ways that they say, or they don't uplift you in ways that are meaningful to you or to your frame of reference. So because we want to belong, we start to try to fit into whatever that group may be discussing or what they find as ideal. And that's very tough because we're in a journey of becoming. This is an internal voyage of discovering yourself continuously. And often, because we want to belong, we start thinking of ourselves as whatever somebody's telling you you are, or a group is telling you you should value. And you never really take that journey to see what matters to you. And so the term Afro-Latino is a great one, but I question, why don't European-based Latinos introduce themselves as Euro-Latino? And why is this something that we continue to have to distinguish? Why don't we approach everybody with a sense of uniqueness and curiosity? And if you don't want to pique that curiosity, why don't we stay open to new information? Because at the very nuclear level of oneself, there's things that we go through every single day. And I personally am very emotional as a Latino, and I don't appreciate when somebody tells me that they care about something and they actually don't. Because for that moment that it mattered to them, I'm still thinking about it, for the entirety of my life, for that month. So we have to be really sensitive. And to the young Latinos out there trying to understand who they are, do the journey internally for yourself and make sure you are who you tell yourself you are versus what any group or anybody is telling you. Make sure you find comfort and liking the things you like individually. And then from there you branch out, because you're more special if you stand out than fit in to any group.
So we were talking here about colorism and other isms in our community. What else do you think is something that the Latino community, the Afro-Latino community, needs to tackle either internally or externally? Can I start with you?
Yeah, I would say we got to find ways to continue to celebrate each other and then continue to build our influence within our own family. So a lot of times we want to look outwardly and think at the macro level, but there's things that we can immediately impact in our own household with our own blood. And that's really meaningful to me because, again, I left my family in Cuba. The last thing I remember my grandmother telling me is, "What are you waiting for? Leave," with tears in her eyes and tears in mine. And I never saw her again. So I dream of having a nucleus, a family here in the United States of America, and building that out in a sustainable way that doesn't let any trending thing or anybody outside of our household divide what we have. So that's my number one goal. That's what drives me to do every single thing I do, because I didn't grow up with cousins or aunties. I grew up with beautiful people that love me, that all look differently than I did, but they weren't my actual family. Yeah. So I'm fighting to establish that within myself. And I think that's the number one thing you can control that isn't something that's fleeting and escaping or that changes week to week.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Michelle?
So you said something that was very beautiful about the fact that oftentimes when we are in a search for belonging, we end up trying to find mirrors in other people. And what I would say to my beautiful Afro-Latino, Black individuals, like Native American, everybody, white, whatever color of your skin, right? And whatever you consider yourself to be, I think that the world would be such a better place if we start from a realm of curiosity. And you mentioned that as well. I think that one of the most powerful things that I was able to do to find my self journey of liberation was to do research of my own history. And that starts oftentimes having conversations with people in your family who really don't want to talk about who they were and where they came from and what challenges they faced. Because, of course, could you imagine like the Latino and the Black community joined together? We're often told, don't talk about your problems. You don't go ahead and therapy. What is therapy? You know. And then I used to remember the saying en casa era, la ropa sucia se lava en la casa. You don't wash dirty laundry unless you're washing it inside of the house, right? But my invitation to all of us is to really go and do a deep dive into your family so that you can start finding those points of celebration of who you truly are and trying to find a way that you can come to peace with who you are and with your history. Because I think that oftentimes we end up looking at our family members and we hold resentments, or we hold, like if I would have just taken on face value what I was facing with my grandmother and what I was facing with so many other members of my family, and I didn't go to understand the discrimination that they went through, the challenges and the journeys, I would have been angry, right? And we carry that with us. And then we look for other people to go ahead and mirror what we want to be seen as, because as humans, each of us, deeply, 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 all of us want to be seen as we see ourselves. But if we don't know who we are ourselves, then we're asking other people to do hard work for us. So my call to the Afro-Latino community and all of us is to just go on a journey, deep dive into yourself, understand your history, and don't let anybody else define you. All of these are boxes. All of these are boxes. We all share a human experience. All of us wake up, we want to do our best. We want to be able to have a home. We want to feed our families. You know, we all have dreams and aspirations. Go inside first and don't let anybody define you.
Yeah. So I always think I'm going to need therapy every time I participate in panels like this, because no, for real, like, you know, I think that for me, coming to Boston in the 70s at the height of the busing era has really shaped a lot of how I navigate spaces and places and how I even show up. And I have a real bad case of imposter syndrome in terms of this whole idea that I don't belong, and that self-love and really seeing myself and honoring who I am and showing up in spaces and places that may not even be ready to receive all of this, right? Because even the way that I speak, you know, I have a lot of, you know, a little swag, right? And that might be a little bit too much for some people, right? And so I'm always constantly trying to making sure that I am not talking myself out of who I am just so that I can walk into a room and be fully expressed. So I always tell people, never leave yourself at the door so you can make other people feel comfortable. Because if they don't like you, you know, don't water yourself down. Let them choke, right? I say those things publicly, but then I struggle with how do I show up in these spaces and places and bring my full self, bring my Afro-Latinidad into spaces and places. How do I navigate spaces that are Latinx only, and when I walk into a room, the first thing when I go into a Latino event, I look to see how many Black Latinos are in that space. And then that's what I pay attention to, right? Are we being inclusive even within our own segment of the population, right? And then when Latinos walk into Black spaces, right? How are Latinos walking into those spaces, right? How are we showing up? Right? And I think those are the sort of things that I'm always trying to grapple with, because what I don't want to do is assume a culture and an identity that I don't belong to. But as an Afro-Latina, right, I look at this, it's not just about my color, it's also about my experience. When I think about the Black experience here in America, it's very similar to my experience as a Latina coming to this country and being told to go back to where I came from. So there's a way of me being able to identify with that plight in ways that some people may not even understand it, because there's also an issue of class, right? And I think that the complexities of this navigation here that we're doing here extends beyond the color of our skin, right? It also has to do with the access that we have, the rooms that we walk into. This is my second time in the Harvard Club. And both times, the first time I came here was because I came in here for an event that the NAACP was doing. And now I'm here with the Globe. Like, I would never be in this space, right? Afro-Latina or city councilor or not, right? And I think that when we talk about the complexities of who we are and how we navigate, we can't ignore the fact of class, because I was the first in my family to graduate high school and college. My mom never made it beyond the 3rd grade. That's a story that a lot of Black folks can identify with. And I think that that complexity has to also be a part of the conversation. And I think that oftentimes it gets lost in the sauce, and Latinos become invisible in a lot of spaces and places. And I think that we have an opportunity and a responsibility to show up and see who's not there and call it out. And then when we are in spaces that we don't think that we belong in, showing up and being respectful of that space and understanding how we occupy space is part of the journey that I am on in my role as an elected. Like, I'm the first Latina ever elected to the Boston City Council. And that is a big weight. I represent over 800,000 constituents. 130 of them are Latinx or Hispanic or Latino or Latini or whatever, because there's so many complexities even in how we label ourselves these days, because everything is political. But at the end of the day, I think that for me, it really is about a journey, and I'm excited to be on it.
Yeah, thank you all for bringing that realness. I so appreciate that. And the last few minutes that we have here, one question that I want to get to is, what is your hope for the Afro-Latino community here, say in like the next year, the next 5 years? What brings you hope?
Well, I'm hopeful that we find our voice, we continue to use it. I really at an individual level hope that we tell ourselves stories of victory and really choose the narrative that benefits us, our mental health, our happiness, our prosperity, because no one's life is absent of struggle and hardship. Right. And we're not unique in that factor. So we gotta have to choose, and I hope anybody listening to me and considering what I'm saying chooses to tell themselves positive stories, remember the good things, and use things that aid their mental health and things that make them happy. And then fight to be the representation you so crave, so that you don't have to fake it anymore. You faced it, and now you can show up to places and not have that imposter syndrome. You're accepted internally for who you are to yourself, and you don't have to join any group or be a part of anybody. You can be an individual, and whoever likes it, great, and whoever doesn't, that's also great too, because if we're all agreeing, somebody's not telling the truth.
I appreciate that. Michelle?
You belong. And I want people that are hearing this to understand that they belong in whichever space they're in. You belong. And if you don't see yourself in a space, like in my job, I'm always looking for ways of representation, seeing representation, like our Black and Latinx technologists that are working in tech companies now that Hack is helping place. You belong. And if you don't see yourself there, figure out a way to be able to go there. And I love the fact that I'm hopeful about representation. I'm hopeful about representation, and I'm also very hopeful about the fact that now more than ever, we're talking about a journey of healing. And I think that when we do our self-healing, a lot more good is going to come. And then you have representation, people are talking, we're taking up space. I'm excited about that.
Yeah. I'm excited about vulnerability. I think it takes a lot of courage to say, I don't know. And I think that we are now in a moment in this country where we're recognizing the power of being able to ask really uncomfortable questions and being humble enough to know that you don't know it all. And I think that we have to call people, like I used to be the call out queen, y'all. I can call you out for whatever you do. But now what I'm trying to do is show up in a world in a way that I'm calling people in and really creating space for us to be in community with each other. And that's my journey. And I think that the more vulnerable that I could be, and demonstrating that understanding I don't know it all and being okay with it, I think that opens up space for other people. I've learned a lot in my time, and I've only been in office for 4 years, but I've learned a lot about politics, and I'm more mindful of how I show up.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much today for bringing your expertise, your stories. I've never had the opportunity to sit with 3 Afro-Latinos like this, so that itself to me is really special. I'm really thankful for the opportunity to like just share that knowledge and have a platform and share it with more people, because I don't feel like I hear enough about Afro-Latinos in general in the media, in national politics, shoot in Boston. I've only been here 6 months, and so I'm rattled that Boston looks dramatically different than the way that I feel like the media has presented it in the last year, 10 years. So thank you again for making the time. It means a lot to me. And thank you to everyone at home that's watching us. I really appreciate it. Thank you for joining us for this panel.